I'm Michael Bungay-Stanier. This is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change. If you're a transformational leader and you're seeking modern change mastery, here's where we imagine different futures and alternative realities. I am not sure when I first heard about scenario planning, but I do remember thinking, oh, this changes everything. I suspect it was in the days when I worked in the world of innovation. And we were very, very focused with this idea of we're in the here and the now and we're trying to create the thing for the moment. Whereas a scenario planning just made me understand that actually what lies ahead in the future is unpredictable and emergent, and we're kind of guessing. But as elusive as the future always is, there's ways that you can get a little clearer about what the future might be. And the scenario planning felt like a real breakthrough moment for me in understanding how I could facilitate change and understand change myself. And if I'm thinking of modern mastery for a change leader, I think scenario planning has to be part of how you approach change in your organization. So what a thrill for me to speak to one of the behemoths of the scenario planning world, Jeremy Bentham. Not the ancient English philosopher, but a contemporary maverick and thinker in the world of change. If you've heard of scenario planning, then you know its apotheosis was in Shell. And Jeremy was the guy at Shell that led that department for 16 years. If you've ever wondered exactly what's the very best way to think about and facilitate scenario planning, your moment has come. Jeremy, welcome.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Michael, and it's a delight to be able to have the conversation.
Jeremy, what's the underappreciated power of scenario planning?
I think there's two aspects to that. So, first of all, I refer to scenario thinking and a scenario mindset as being part of strategic character. So it's not necessarily about having a specific written scenario or a written plan, although that can be part of the whole thing. But it's a way of thinking. And you'll appreciate that currently our world is being shaped by some very powerful currents.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been shaped in the past by some very powerful currents, and that will continue. And whenever you get a powerful current, you also get powerful countercurrents.
Right.
And you can't tell in advance which is going to be the most powerful. So alternative outcomes are always plausible. And that's a fundamental aspect of reality. It's not that the future is random, but these different currents can combine in different ways that make different outcomes quite plausible. And we have to explore that landscape. So in that sense, if you're not exploring that landscape with some kind of scenario thinking, you're engaging in lazy strategy. And we don't want to do that. I do also add, however, that you're trying to make wiser decisions. That's ultimately what you're trying to do.
Right.
So in that sense, the scenario thinking is secondary to the decisions, but it's the way that you make wiser decisions.
For people who are listening to this for the first time and they're like, look, I'm not even quite sure what you two are whittering on about. What actually is this thing that you're talking about? Can you lay out the basics for us? And particularly perhaps for somebody who's like, okay, I'm leading change, I'm in a biggish organization. Is this a podcast I should keep listening to? Or is this just something that is only useful if you're trying to do really long-term planning in an energy company?
The scenario work, some aspects of it have a long-term purpose, but some things can have a very short-term purpose.
Right.
I could give you examples. I remember because I had to lead activities when September the 15th, 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Uh-huh.
The entire economy came down, and I'm in front of the board by the end of September with recession and recovery scenarios to help think through the decisions being made. So there is not a particular time frame. It depends on the circumstances. You're probably aware the word strategy comes from the ancient Greek word, I think it's strategos,
right,
which means the art of the general. And that's why too often, in fact, people draw military analogies for strategy. And
Right.
some can be useful and some of them are really misleading, as I'm sure you're aware. But really what that is the ability to try and take a good look at the whole landscape
Mm.
and then deploy your resources effectively to achieve some kinds of goals. And so looking at the landscape is really valuable. It's essential for the general. And for the kinds of decisions that you're making, you're actually trying to look at the future landscape, the
Right.
landscape in which those decisions will play out. And that landscape, when you begin to consider those driving forces, those currents and countercurrents,
Hmm.
there will be a few things within that landscape that are steady in different types of outlooks, but there are also critical uncertainties.
Right.
And so, in exploring the landscape and scenario thinking coherently about how these things come together, you get a sense of what the boundaries of plausibility are, what the steady expectations are, and what the critical uncertainties are. And you can make your choices then to be resilient or robust or attractive across those different plausible outlooks.
Brilliant. Boundaries, steady expectations, and critical uncertainties. So that's great. So I imagine that initially, one of the things I'm trying to do in the future that I'm concerned about, whatever that time length might be, depending on the decisions I'm trying to make, I'm first of all trying to understand what those are, to map those, to collect those,
Yeah.
to uncover those.
Yes, that's right. So you think about the driving forces,
Yeah.
the potential issues that you think are important, and one way to start sorting them out in your head is to think about kind of like how important each one of these might be
Mm.
to your decision and how uncertain they are. And so you can think of a kind of mapping, but perhaps you've identified 20 issues or 20 driving forces. And you kind of start mapping out, okay, uh, I wouldn't have thought of it unless it was important, but this is from important to very important.
Right.
Or it can be, actually, I'm pretty ignorant about that.
I'm going to jump in and just make a quick recommendation on 2 episodes you might consider checking out. Leila Ajarulu and or Emily Moore's episode. Look, they both have good takes on understanding and mapping complexity.
So there's important to very important to I'm ignorant.
Yeah.
And similarly on uncertainty, you can say, well, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen,
Right.
or it's uncertain, or I really don't know. I'm ignorant about that. And
Yeah.
so if you imagine laying that out along those two axes, the cluster of things that are in the top right, which are very important, very uncertain, or you're completely ignorant about, are the
Right.
things you kind of need to be putting your attention on in looking at how those things could come together to shape different outcomes.
Got it. So that's where you're looking for the variables to
Yeah.
kind of go, well, if it was this or if it was that, that's going to tip me to one path on the crossroads or the other path on the crossroads.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. You mentioned 20. Is there a number that you should be collecting? I mean, a good enough amount of data that could be helpful.
You involve people that you respect because of their thoughtfulness
Mm.
and also their diversity, their spread of interests.
Yeah.
So people, for instance, with a view on, say, macroeconomics or international relations or
Mm.
technology, and you're looking for the things that they agree about, but also the things that thoughtful people disagree about, because that's likely to be a critical uncertainty.
Got it.
And so you go through that process.
That's great. It feels like this must be part science and part art. I mean, part science to collect the data, part art to appreciate how much you actually know about it. But I imagine there's some real art in the articulation of the different scenarios based on the data set that you've chosen. So how do you bring these different scenarios to life in a way that feels compelling to people?
You said science and art.
Yeah.
You may recall earlier I used the term craft.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that craft is an appropriately humble term
Right.
because science and art sound too grand for what you're kind of practically trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think that humility is an important characteristic, not only for people who are involved with scenarios, to be open to learning new things and to
Mm-hmm.
different views, but also it's part of the strategic character of any senior leader.
Look, I think this is a great insight. It's less about scenario planning per se, it's more about how we see ourselves in the world. The people I most admire live into the paradox of being both humble and confident. Humble before the work, confident in themselves to do the work. Okay, back to Jeremy.
I think that that's an important factor of that. So
Right.
I'll use that humble word of craft that I mentioned. And one of the crafts, as you say, is this bringing the kinds of insights that you're uncovering or illuminating through scenario thinking actually to life in the minds of decision makers.
Mm-hmm.
But every senior leader I know and I've worked with, and I've worked
A lot.
with a lot, not just
Yeah.
inside shell, but outside shell. It's part of the mantra. They will tell you that they're always open to learn. That's part of a leadership mantra.
Yeah.
My experience is they hate being taught.
Okay, stand by here because Jeremy's about to explain how influence can work and how we might best engage these senior stakeholders.
Because let's face it, they feel they're bright, they're successful.
Exactly.
They don't like to have that sense.
Right.
So you can't go in a way that people feel you're trying to teach them something or twist their arm or
Got it.
that's not going to work. That just builds resistance. So you have to find
People do not love feeling consciously incompetent.
Yes.
Particularly if you're an executive where you're consciously competent.
Absolutely.
Or even unconsciously competent, which is like, I am a master of my domain.
Yeah.
And now you're making me feel like I am not a master of my domain. And I do not like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the situation that you're potentially facing.
Yeah.
And what you're trying to do is bring people to a place where they learn something for themselves.
Mm.
I don't know whether you know, I don't greatly know of the Austrian philosopher Schopenhauer. He's got
I can't even, I know, I think I could spell his name in a pinch, but that's possibly the extent of my philosophical knowledge.
Well, he must have said this in German, so I can probably mistranslate it slightly. But it was something like new truths or new insights was one of his points, are first ignored or ridiculed, then vehemently opposed, and ultimately taken to be self-evident. And so what you're trying to do is take people on a journey towards this becoming self-evident.
Right.
That they knew it already, or this is so obvious.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're trying to do. And there's various ways that you can approach that. The circumstances in which you have conversations about these issues are very important. But just something that you might think is trivial, but is really important, is names for scenarios.
Right.
Giving you an example, the first energy scenario suite that I led within Shell was in 2006, 2007. And we went through quite a process of selecting the names for those. We had working names from the beginning for the team as we went around things. But ultimately, there were several possibilities for names, and I, as the leader, ultimately had to kind of pick one then. But we'd really been around a whole set of stakeholders in surfacing possible names, and so we'd been through a big process. Always within a few weeks of selecting the name, you find that nobody in the team can even remember other alternatives because it's sunk into their heads.
Yeah.
Then when you go out, so I, back in those days, was talking with the Singaporean government and with senior and junior ministers there. And those two scenarios at that time were called scramble and blueprints.
Right.
And those names said something about the dynamics within the scenarios that got into people's heads. And so only last year or maybe 18 months ago, I was talking with somebody who is now a very senior minister in Singapore. And this is what it's heading for 20 years later.
Yeah.
And he starts using the terms scramble and blueprint
Wow.
in a conversation. It had just kind of got into his head.
Yeah.
And so how you get into people's heads can be in different ways. The conversation I'd had with him 20 years before was actually not a formal presentation or anything. It was a round table dinner. I had no PowerPoint presentation. I just kind of explained, and we had a glass of wine and we talked things through,
Yeah.
but it got into his head.
I love that. Jeremy's got a newsletter on Beehive called the Dodo Club. A quick Google will find that. And really, it's the best place to connect and see what he's up to and follow his work. Why Dodo Club? Well, all is explained at the end of the interview. So, Jeremy, you've created this scenario. Then there must be this moment where you're inviting people to go, if that is the scenario, what do we do about that?
Yes. Yeah.
So how do you guide people to understand what their choices are in that moment?
So this isn't some kind of sequential thing. Over time, you've had strategic conversations in which have probably started with thinking about, what are key reflection areas,
Right.
and then the development of some kind of scenario thinking, but also thinking about implications, because the kinds of decisions you're trying to make also shape the nature of the scenarios that you're developing to help make those decisions as well. So there's ongoing conversations
Right.
that are there. And along that line, you begin to have the conversations about implications and decisions. I used to like to have conversations around what I called key beliefs, but consequential key beliefs. So it wasn't just that, we believe that, say, natural gas is going to remain an important contributor to the energy system for quite some time, growing first in global demand and then declining.
Right.
That's a belief that you can have about the future, but a consequential belief is, in believing that, we should start that, stop that, do more of that, do less of that.
This reminds me a bit of the what, so what, now what model. The so what is your consequential key belief. And I suspect consequential here is doing kind of double duty. It's not just, and here are the consequences of the what, but they're also, at a kind of deeper level, consequences to taking a stand, expressing a belief, generating a reaction.
And so we'd lay those out in conversation with the executive committee and the board, and have one-on-one conversations with all these people to understand their response to that key belief. And sometimes they would say, well, there's too many key beliefs, and so consolidate those.
Yeah.
But I used to recognize, in the social context of being in collective group meetings with committees, that a lot of time and effort was taken up discussing differences in nuances that weren't that important.
Right.
So what I would do is have the conversations with the individuals and say, for this key belief, is this a green flag for you, a yellow flag, or a red flag? So green flag meant, oh yeah, no, I'm okay with that. That's great.
Yeah.
Yellow flag was, Yeah, I guess I'd phrase it differently, but yeah, that's okay. And red flag is no, 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 no. I don't get that.
No, yeah,
So by the time you've been around, spoken with everybody, you actually find out that so much of this is in the green and the yellow.
yeah,
And what's really important is the reds. And then you can go back collectively and give them the feedback. Look, I said, look, we're more or less agreed on these
yeah,
areas,
that's great.
but we have different views on these areas. Let's talk about that. Is there any more work we should do that will help you think better about that?
Mm.
And so you begin to have that type of rich conversation, but that's been enabled and underpinned and stimulated by some thinking about the future.
This is fantastic stuff. Look, I imagine it at its very best when you go through this whole experience and this process, and the people that matter engage in a way that is robust and excited and creative. It's a thrilling experience. I also imagine you've seen more than once a kind of a token
Yeah.
level of engagement, which is like, this is fun, this is playful, this is interesting. I'll certainly kind of vaguely contribute on the day, but it feels like a bit of a game. And then we just go back to the predictable, the obvious, the path that we're on and we're going to stay on.
Yeah.
What's the difference between the two? I mean, how do you avoid the kind of the tokenism of it and the tolerating of it into the commitment to something like this?
Look, it's again, I don't think there's a cookie cutter answer to that, and it's not just sometimes tokenism. There's actually sometimes hostility.
Right, right. Yeah,
I was fortunate. I was a senior executive in Shell, so I had to be given some um,
yeah.
respect organizationally,
At least to your face.
but at least to my face. But in the kind of conversations I would have with the directors of the company, uh, there was for a period one particular downstream director who basically didn't want to see me in his office. He believed he knew how the world was,
Right.
and he just was pretty hostile towards somebody coming in, particularly somebody coming in and talking about energy transition topics. That ultimately proved to be very important and significant. So you kind of have to recognize that.
Yeah.
But you can do things that hook into processes that people do think are important.
Mm.
So scenarios might feel like, oh, it's something abstract or blue sky,
Yeah.
which it isn't. But people recognize the importance of strategy or the importance of decision making
Yeah.
or a decision process. So you look for the ways to weave scenario thinking into that. You're looking for those ways.
Yeah.
I used to have amongst my team a nickname of Mr. Drip Drip. And the reason for it was in any kind of informal engagement I had with senior executives, I would drip some thoughts into the conversation
Right.
and say, oh, have you noticed that? Or I've been thinking about that. What do you think about that? And I just kind of drip it in.
Yeah.
And then when I saw them again, a couple of weeks later, I'd come back and I'd say a bit more. And they'd forgotten the previous conversation, but they thought, I've heard something like that before. It must be important. And so it would begin to get into people's heads that way.
Nice.
So you can find those ways of doing things.
We're really wrestling here with how power works. Now, you may not have the high status that Jeremy a few moments ago mentioned that he had, but I do think it's a really powerful insight. I mean, what's your version of a drip campaign? In fact, I'm reminded of a quote I just read from Rebecca Solnit. Here it is. Cause and effect assumes history marches forward. But history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension.
And also, find opportunities. When people are being engaged with something new, they can be either in a relaxed state or a stressed state, and they can be either sort of indifferent or engaged. And it's only when they're relaxed and engaged do they learn. So you've got to help circumstances where people can feel relaxed, they can slip into that thinking slow mode, but you're meeting them where they are on something that they think's important.
Nice.
You might be looking eventually to take them a bit further away from what they already think that's important, but you meet them there.
Yeah.
And so, for example, towards the end of the year, after the financial plan had been nailed down and there was this kind of gap in December, I'd often have a couple of important workshops there with the most senior folks in Shell, and not around a big board table. There was a sort of a studio space that was comfortable, that was there, and I'd approach it very informally, and they'd approach that informally. I mean, I hadn't been informal in the way we planned the circumstances there,
Exactly.
but it just kind of felt a relaxed atmosphere where people felt comfortable with sharing their thoughts on these, say, key reflection areas on geopolitics or technology developments, etc. And that created an environment in which people often found that they had learned something, but they discovered it for themselves in that circumstance that we'd helped create. And of course, you're inputting things into that, but they're learning for themselves. Another kind of image that my team used to use was that we were creating the corporate sandbox for senior leaders to play in.
Nice.
And discover things that we'd hidden in there.
Oh, I love that.
I must admit.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor.
These are bright people. Sometimes they discover things that we hadn't put in there, but were really interesting for us, so we take those away as well.
Yeah.
But I think those images of the drip, drip, drip and the corporate sandbox kind of can be helpful on how you get that engagement with the key ideas, even though people might not even recognize that those key ideas had a scenario type origin. That doesn't matter. The scenario stuff is the means to the end.
Yeah, and I love this. Kind of takes us back to where we started, which is the point is to make better decisions.
Yeah.
So how do you make better decisions in a way that allows the company to thrive?
Yeah.
Jeremy, I've got a kind of unexpected question, perhaps. Over your right shoulder, I'm seeing the dodo from Alice in Wonderland. What's the significance of that in the world of scenario planning and thinking and mindset, if anything?
Yes, the dodo is kind of really significant because the purpose of the team was to ensure that the company didn't go the way of the dodo.
Nice.
So the dodo was perfectly evolved for a given circumstance and had been for millions of years.
Yeah.
But circumstances changed and it went extinct quickly. The dodo became, if you like, the motif for the team. And so there's a lot of dodos around me in this room. And in fact, the fortnightly newsletter, free newsletter for people that I put out, is called the Dodo Club Newsletter.
So don't go the way of the dodo. And that's not me being facetious. In fact, it's the whole point of Change Signal. I think there are too many tools and frameworks and approaches to change that honestly have the hint of the dodo to them. And I'm looking for the very best in change and transformation today. And if you think I'm finding it, then you might be saying to yourself, well, now is the time to show Michael a little love. A review, a post on LinkedIn, a recommendation to a friend. All of those are very gratefully received. We do grow best by word of mouth. Thanks for doing the work. I'm glad you're here.